Okay, so no commenter explicitly requested this video, but I'm gonna call it a commenter suggestion anyway based on what I read all the time in my comments, namely regarding genetic studies about the ethnicities and origins of people. Now, yes, this is a quagmire of politics, but I'll often respond with the fact that I don't trust genetic studies. And in this video, I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't either. But in addition to going into science, we're also going to get into a bit of philosophy and sociology. Archaeology is the bridge between social science and hard science after all, so let's build that bridge today. So how do genetic studies determine the origins of a person and their ethnicity, and why is it untrustworthy? And let me get on top of the inevitable angry comments, and let me apologize in advance for any clumsy wording, because you'll hear a lot of things from me today about how ethnicity was invented or created. But this does not mean that your ethnicity does not exist, or that it's not real, or a valid piece of your identity, nor am I attempting to invalidate it. I'm going to be presenting the hard science and a historical background as to how ethnicity has been used and thought about, and we're going to intersperse it with some philosophy as well. So yes, I will be saying that ethnicity is a social construct, but that is not an invalidation of identity. Government is also a social construct. That does not make government illegitimate. Borders are a social construct. That does not make borders illegitimate. All of human society is a social construct. That's exactly why it's called social. And since archaeology is about bridging the scientific with the social, that does mean entering into philosophical discussions. So I'm not telling you your ethnicity is not real. I'm only asking you to think about what defines it. So with that out of the way, let's get on to the uncontroversial stuff, the hard science. Now at first glance, genetic testing of ethnicity seems to be reliable. Humans, as I'm sure you already know, have 23 chromosomes, all of which provide different information. Your biological gender is determined based on the 23rd chromosome, and it's through this pair that we can trace parentage and relationships. In males only, we can trace paternal lineage through the Y chromosome, and in everybody, we can trace maternal lineage through the X chromosome. This can then be compared with DNA collected from others, and we can see overlaps that show a relationship. This is why it's very easy to determine your actual genetic relatives. The other 22 chromosomes, meanwhile, can be compared in the same way, and it's on these chromosomes that we tend to find ethnic origins. Very simply, when you submit your DNA, it's run through a computer program that analyzes your DNA in smaller, more manageable chunks and compares the whole thing against a huge genetic reference collection of every known ethnicity. If your genes then come back that matches you to predominantly, say, Arab and Turkish, then you're given the designation Arab and Turkish. Similarly with every other ethnicity or mix of them you can think of on the planet. And furthermore, once this is analyzed, your DNA is added to this dataset, allowing for further accuracy in the future. So in short, the more people who take a test, the more accurate these tests become. Okay, so that all seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? And genetic data for descent and relations is very reliable, especially for forensics and medicine. You might be able to see a problem with the model I just described, but we can simplify that problem by saying that humans have agency, and that's a problem for science. See, it's tempting to see genetics as a magic bullet, especially given all the proven good it has done. But good science used the wrong way is still flawed science. It looks reliable because when good science is used right, it is reliable. And genetics is good science. Make no mistake, I am not going to argue that point. But as a result, many highly educated and intelligent people can be fooled because they focus too much on the science and treat human society as inconsequential. And that is the issue with genetic testing on ethnicity, because it assumes that humans are a static society. We already know that this is wrong. Humans have always moved. We've always migrated. It assumes that even in areas where very little has taken place, that this society was not multicultural on a macroscopic level. Cities are multicultural places, and we've had cities for as long as we've been sedentary. And they have ways of making themselves felt in the rural areas too. And herein lies the first major problem with genetic testing on ethnicity. It relies on a basic definition of what that ethnicity actually is. So, if the original genetic reference for what a Russian is wrong, everything else that comes back as Russian will be flawed too. And these flaws will be compounded as more and more flawed results get added to the reference collection. And many of these reference collections are going to be wrong. The unspoken truth is that many of these original genotypes rely on information given to us from modern living populations and how they identify mixed with some written historical records, and many living populations are simply unaware of the true tapestry of their genetic origins, or will say they're just this from what they believe to be true based on what they know of their own family history. You wouldn't believe how many British people I spoke to who would hear of my own diverse genetic background and they'd say, oh, I'm just boring old English all the way up. But they were wrong. If you think your genetic history is boring, this usually means that the true diversity of your genetic heritage has been covered up over centuries because on some level it mattered in the past, where people could be ostracized for being in a mixed family, and on some level it didn't matter because your ancestors were still a member of that community. They'd become familiar names and faces, and an overall lack of education or literacy meant that they only knew what they were told, i.e. you've always been here, and that's all that was ever passed on, and your diverse ancestors get lost in the crowd. Let's take this boring old English for an example. Well, what is English in the first place? Typically, it's referred to as Anglo-Saxon, which is actually a mix of at least 3 migrating genetic groups. Before them, you had the Celts and the pre-Celtic cultures, and then you had Scandinavian invasions and settlement. But there is a larger issue at play here. To define who belongs in what ethnicity and how to find mixtures of it, we first have to define what ethnicity actually is, and what makes that a pure genetic sample. An ethnic group is defined as a people who have a shared language, culture, geographic region, and genetic origin. Okay, sounds straightforward. But is it? Let's examine each of these elements in turn. Let's start with culture. What is culture? Well, in the broadest and most simplified sense, it's a way of looking at and interacting with the world shaped by the community you grew up in. Easy, right? But here's the problem. Culture doesn't always have an ethnicity. There is definitely such a thing as Canadian or American culture. No one would deny this. But there is no such thing as a Canadian or an American ethnicity. Again, no one would deny this. So you might be thinking that's fine, but these are colonial nations. They're relatively young. Well, you have a point, but colonialism is not new. What goes for one colonial system goes for another. When Phoenicians colonized Tunisia, they mixed with the local Berbers. They had to. It is very hard work to build a society with no help. It took us 100,000 years to do that the first time, and we don't really want to do that again. And the more people move, the more mingling comes naturally. Romans, for example, were very liberal with their citizenship, and their cities became magnets for people from all corners of the empire and even people beyond it. It was an ancient Schengen zone. Absolute freedom of movement across a well-developed road network with no borders stretching from Luxor to Odessa to York. Everyone could serve in the army, and the army could be sent anywhere. And we all know what soldiers do in a foreign land. These people and their descendants didn't suddenly teleport back to their original ethnic group when the empire collapsed. They stayed, they mixed, and their descendants eventually became the later populations, indistinguishable from the locals. All they'd know is your father was a Roman soldier, and that meant very little 4 generations later. And it's a mistake to think that this didn't happen elsewhere or at other times. In Spain, you might be descended from a Jew or a Moor, a victim of the Inquisition forced to convert and hide their identity, hoping for a better life for their children. In pre-Columbian North America, we see Athapascan speakers from northern Canada migrate themselves down to the Great Basin for reasons that are still unknown. Check out this language map of pre-colonial North America and see how mixed it was. A few videos back, I even discussed how migration changed the face of Cyprus during the Bronze Age collapse. Which reminds me, please like and subscribe for future videos. We can point to instances of mass migration across the archaeological record for as long as humans have been alive. So where does an ethnic boundary begin and end, both in geographic and in cultural terms? How do you treat those on the borders of such zones, regardless of politics, and what happens if the border shifts? And do those who leave them cease to be members? Okay, fine, so culture cannot identify ethnicity. Neither really can borders. What about language? Well, all the angry commenters on my Macedonia video are insistent that language is the defining feature. Alexander the Great spoke Greek, therefore he was Greek, I'm wrong, end of story. Let's apply that logic. If that's the definition, everyone who speaks French must be ethnically French. So let's see, we have France, Belgium, Switzerland, Quebec, the DRC, Côte d'Ivoire, Haiti, Comoros, Vanuatu. Okay, I think I'm seeing a problem. Perhaps it's only within France's borders. Okay, we have Normans, Burgundians, Bretons, Flemish. Yeah, that's not a good indicator either. And it doesn't help going the other way. We find people who are totally ethnically pure, but don't speak one word of their original ethnic language. While such people are more common today and in Western nations, it's not a new phenomenon. What's changed is how easy it's become to travel longer distances and how accepting our society has become, not their presence. And for further proof of how tricky this gets, let's look at South Korea. Facing an aging population crisis, South Korea is looking to bring in ethnic Koreans from abroad to make up the work shortage. These people from Central Asia, called Koreoans, are recognized as ethnically Korean. The problem is that many of them only speak Russian. So the Korean government considers these people ethnic Koreans, but they don't speak the language, they weren't born in Korea, and they have a different Central Asian variant of the culture than the one practiced in South Korea. But they must be Korean, right? So might make a strong point for today, but perhaps these immigrants just didn't interbreed as much as I'm suggesting they did in the ancient world. Society was far less accepting after all, and past populations were largely rural, beyond the multi-ethnic cities. Plus, communities liked to marry within each other. Well, yes, all of this is true. But simple math will tell you that at least one of your medieval ancestors was a city dweller, probably more. It also doesn't account for adoption into and out of these communities, the rape and pillage of the countryside by invaders, or shifting borders. Okay, but what's one baby in one village? Surely overall, if isolation is continued, it doesn't make a difference. Well, if we ask that, then we have to ask how many generations must pass before a child is once more considered ethnically pure. And as soon as you realize that there is literally no scientific, non-racist way to answer that, you'll see another massive problem with these studies. So what are we left with? If ethnicity isn't determined by science, what is it determined by? Well, honestly, it's how we think about it. Because all of these things help determine your ethnicity, but not all of them do. You can be accepted as a certain ethnicity with any combination of these factors, or have all of them and still be rejected. It depends on what you consider yourself to be, and if those who identify as such are willing to have you. Ethnicity is an entirely social construct. And this is where genetic testing tries to use a hammer to fix a screw. It seeks a scientific way to define a social construct. Genes can determine a mix of what we call ethnicities, but what we use as a genetic baseline for those ethnicities is based on a social definition. But humans, especially scientists, love to categorize and classify everything, including ourselves. They're one of the ways humans make sense of the world that we live in. But it's equally important to remember that people do not, and never have, fit into little boxes. Scientific studies only take into account objective observation, but the mixing of human genes are shaped by subjective decisions. So, if all this is the case, why did we invent ethnicity in the first place? Well, here, whether you agree with it or not, you probably expect me to say racism and xenophobia. But the joke's on you, I am not. Don't get me wrong, that definitely played its part, but defining ethnic origins is actually based in a different sort of politics. Until the invention of nation-states, there was nothing else to bind people, though borders and rulers shifted often, tearing communities apart. The world hasn't always been kind to outsiders either. Kings and empires played on this idea of a shared ethnic identity, and to an extent it was true. Communication was much harder and slower then, and it was natural to form communities and find bonds closer to home. But then we get to the Enlightenment. By this time, nation-states were a thing, and autocrats were falling out of fashion. Everything needed to have a basis in reason, logic, and science. But scholars couldn't simply just erase ethnic identities either, not that many tried outside of the Marxist school of thought. As a result, there was a drive to provide a scientific framework for it. Ethnicity, culture, and a true language of the identity of a nation's people were studied, codified, and annotated by the educated elites, while the illiterate rural farmers likely still felt no closer to a shared kinship beyond their local community. And a true idea of a pure ethnicity was invented out of political necessity, a way to draw borders of these new states built on a common identity away from centralized autocrats. But by identifying who was like you, based on a set of characteristics beyond your control, you created an identity that was not like you, and people who were not like you couldn't properly understand you. And yes, some pushed back against this notion, most famously America's founding fathers, who understood that anyone could be American, but not anyone could be Slavic. A similar story unfolded in other ex-colonies. This isn't to say that these places didn't have their own racist and prejudiced assumptions, but overall the idea was to make a new country that anyone could be a part of. But those fighting against an absolutist empire needed to ground themselves in ethnicity, because to say anything else was to grant absolutists legitimacy, that they could be one of you and thus continue to rule you. Thus, a strict, guarded, and exclusive definition of ethnicity emerged. And this way of thinking is used as both a sword and a shield. It legitimizes your struggle against those who might say you're not a valid culture, that your rights don't matter, or that you don't belong there, and go about erasing it. And there are a lot of people in the world today who do try to erase ethnicities based on these arguments. And when this happens, it's natural to hold your ethnicity up as a shield, to hold up a definition of it, and to defend yourself from attack. And this is absolutely fair. It is admirable and expected that you want to defend your own people. But there are autocrats, wannabe autocrats, warlords, and media figures who will tell you that looking after your own people means guarding them jealously, refusing to interact with other groups, and closing your history off to criticism. They will point to those who try to present a more nuanced view, and they will say that they are the enemy or a traitor. They convince people that they have less in common with their neighbor than they do with a much richer dictator feasting in his golden hall because he is like them and your neighbor is not. And those who are not like you are a threat to be eliminated. Ethnicity becomes a weapon of attack used to commit the worst kinds of atrocities. And to repeat what I said at the beginning, this is not meant to invalidate your ethnicity. It's supposed to urge you to think critically about where you come from. Being proud of your ethnicity, taking a DNA test, and celebrating your culture does not make you a xenophobe any more than thinking critically about its history makes you a traitor. Arguing otherwise would be like saying that reading any book is racist because some of them are written by fascists. It isn't about how you define your ethnicity. It's about how you think about those who do not fit the definition of it. And remember, genetic studies are not entirely useless either. They still can tell us a lot about human origins, where we come from, and how we all relate to each other. Anyway, that's my rant. I know there wasn't a lot of archaeology in it today, but given how often I see genetic studies quoted, both in my research and in my comments, I did feel the need to address it. Sorry there wasn't much archaeology today, there will be in the next video. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.